Welcome to Man in America, a voice of reason in a world gone mad. I'm your host, Seth Holhouse. So the topic of today's show can be summarized in a single tweet, which I'll be going over later in the show, but also right now. If you really want to know just how bad things are, talk to a middle school teacher. The kids are not okay. They can't read, they can't write, they can't critically think, they can't emotionally regulate, and they can't socialize. So my guest today, Alex Newman, is someone that I would consider to be an expert in the modern education system. Now, when I say expert, he's not someone that has a master's in teaching and he's not a teacher, but he's someone that has deconstructed the modern public education system here in America to figure out why is it that right now, in 2025, a significant portion of children are graduating from high school without being functionally literate. Doesn't make any sense. You'd think that we'd be getting more intelligent. You'd think that education would be improving with all these advancements and everything. Yet why is it that the American population is getting dumber and dumber and dumber? Makes you think, whose plan is this? Well, this is what I love doing on this show, is going back in history to figure out what happened 50, 100, 200 years ago. What plans were set in place to bring us to right where we are today? And it might surprise you, wink, wink, to understand that the reason why these kids are like this points to one person, John D. Rockefeller Sr. And that's what we're going to be diving into in today's topic, is basically how the Rockefellers took over the education system in America 100 years ago, over 100 years ago, to create an education system that wouldn't teach children how to think critically, how to solve problems, how to negotiate, how to understand personal finance, but would rather teach children how to memorize things, how to recite useless facts, but not teach them anything of value. Basically teaching them how to be factory workers or even slaves submitting to the oligarchy or whatever you want to refer to these elitists that think that they can control our society. And so today, in today's show, we're going to be doing a deep dive into the history and getting into the communist infiltration and into John Dewey, into the origins of our modern education system. Because if we want to fix what's happening in America right now, we have to figure out where it went wrong. We have to figure out what were the original intentions, what were the original plans that were set into place so that we can deconstruct those things and change them. Because unfortunately, the kids that are graduating from high school today in 2025, in 10, 20, 30 years, these are our future leaders, our future CEOs, our future presidents. Obviously, the smart ones will be, but the rest of them will be on government sustenance and barely getting by and hooked on fentanyl and who knows what. And so this will be an interesting topic. Alex is a good friend, smart guy, great beard, by the way, which is really important in my book at least. And so we're just going to be looking at the education system and how it's been corrupted. It's the same way that I've done deep dives into our medical system. And surprise, surprise, there's also that John D. Rockefeller Sr. guy that also corrupted our medical system. And so I think that we're at a crossroads right now where we actually have a chance to look at these systems, whether it's big pharma, education system, medical system, and so much more, and figure out where it was corrupted and how we can fix it. And that's going to be the topic of today's show. Just a quick reminder, every show that I do is done as a podcast as well. So if you're more of a podcast listener, go to your favorite podcast app, search for Man in America. You'll find me there. And if you want to leave a review, especially on Apple Podcasts, which is the biggest podcast network, or Spotify as well, but if you leave those reviews, that are really helpful in helping us to reach more people, which is really, that's the purpose of the show, is I'm trying to get the truth out to people, the best that I can, in the most honest way that I can, because I care about the future of our nation. I care about, the nation my children will grow up in. And that's why I'm doing this. So I hope that you learn something from this. I'm sure you will. Alex is extremely intelligent. And if you enjoy it, I hope you can share it. And again, please enjoy this interview with Alex Newman. Mr. Alex Newman, it's great to have you back on the show, man. It's been quite some time, but thank you for being here.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me, Seth.
So I reached out to you probably a month or so ago. You were traveling. I forget. You were somewhere. Was it India, or I forget, you were somewhere around the world doing something probably really important. My wife had an interview with you, I think an SGT report on in the kitchen when she was doing something, and I heard you talking about this information about the origins of the kind of contemporary education system here in America, and it was shocking to me. And so I kind of bookmarked that in the back of my mind. I thought, okay, once he's back, we'll do an interview about this. But in the meantime, I've been seeing so much information coming out talking about, I mean, unfortunately, how stupid the children are in our nation that are being brought up under public education. And actually, I'll pull one tweet up really quickly here that I just saw last night. It says, if you really want to know just how bad things are, talk to a middle school teacher. The kids are not okay. They can't read, they can't write, they can't critically think, they can't emotionally regulate, and they can't socialize. So I know that education is really one of your core areas of focus. And I'd love just to get your thoughts on both just some statistics on where the kids really are at right now in America, but also kind of I want to take a deep dive into the origins of our modern education system and the infiltration earlier on and the overall plan behind this all. So I'll just hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Seth. And I'm glad we're talking about this. It is, I believe, the most significant existential threat to our country, to our freedom. And I don't think you can understand the mess that we're in without understanding the fact that education paved the way to get us here. When I look at the data that the government itself is putting out about education, first of all, it's very misleading. But even if you accept it at face value, it's clear we have an existential threat. Last year, the federal government released what they call the National Assessment of Educational Progress. They call it the Nation's Report Card for short. And this is supposed to be a gauge of where American students are at relative to where they were before and all the rest of it. Well, according to the federal government's own data, less than 1 in 3 victims of what passes for a public education system in this country are even proficient in anything. Okay, we're talking reading, writing, math, civics, you name it. Now, when I say proficient, I don't mean they've mastered it. I don't mean they're good at it. Proficiency is not the highest mark. Proficiency is the absolute bare minimum. And even that's very misleading. If an average, well-educated person understood what the government means by proficient, they would be appalled. The real data is far worse than the federal government's numbers suggest. And I want people to let that sink in for a minute. Let's just take it at face value. Let's say almost 1 in 3 children in 4th grade and in 8th grade are proficient in reading and math. What does that mean for the future of our country? If you go back to 1983, Ronald Reagan put together the National Commission on Excellence in Education. And even back then, he said this represents a threat to our future as a nation and as a people. He said if an unfriendly foreign power had imposed this on us, we would have viewed it as an act of war. Well, it's orders of magnitude worse. And it's not just that they are dumber than ever before. Right? That's one major problem, but it's one of many problems. I would argue that even more significant is the indoctrination. These are children who not only don't know anything and don't have the ability to reason, don't have the ability to access information, they believe that they're the smartest thing to have ever walked on this planet. They believe they're programming on whatever issue it is. It could be climate change, it could be gender, it could be global citizenship, whatever silly program they're trying to install in the minds of these children. They believe that that is the absolute truth. And they've been conditioned, very much like Pavlov's dogs, to have a visceral, emotional response to anything that challenges these false ideas and this false worldview that's been instilled in them. So it's very hard to overestimate the enormity of this crisis, Seth. And I do believe that if we don't deal with this, none of the other issues are going to matter, right? I recognize communist China is an existential threat, the open border, the collapsing dollar. I mean, all these things are hugely important, and I think they need to be talked about. But if we fail on this, the government's got 85% of our kids right now for 12 years. If we fail to address this, all of it is just a waiting game for the totalitarians.
And so it's interesting how you broke it into 2 parts. One is intelligence, right? Which I guess really it's more like, what are they being taught? Are they being taught how to, can they read, can they write, all those core functions? But then the other being, what are they being taught? Indoctrination, right? And that's the whole other part of it. And I have that experience too. Like I have a childhood friend that a few years younger than me, and she, I went through school, and I went to a private art school, college, right? So I did 4 years and got my degree in industrial design, and somehow I wasn't affected by a lot of the liberal stuff that was being promoted there, and it left college with this mission to fight communism instead of to advance the goals of communism per se. But this other person kind of went the opposite, and was kind of sold all the indoctrination, watches the very liberal media. And it's like, okay, well, that's fine if that's the choice that she has and she can do those things. However, I can't even talk about things like and this is the interesting thing that you mentioned, like the conditioning and the psychological response to it, right? People talk about, TDS and Trump derangement syndrome. Well, it's so much deeper than that. Like, I can't even mention probably 85% of things I think really matter in this world, because there's this instant shutdown, right? Like, if someone that is, let's just say I run into an Antifa person on the street and they say, hey, you know what, Seth, look, I want to have just a rational conversation with you. I want to explain why I'm out here burning down buildings and why I believe this. I'd say, okay, like I'll hear you out. Like, let me hear your ideas, and I'll compare them against my worldview and my ideas, and maybe I'll learn something. But I'll at least have that discussion. But it doesn't happen the other way around. Like, the programming is so successful that it rejects, and it causes this physical response of almost like you want to vomit if something is counter to your own ideology, which is brilliant if you're trying to program people, because it means that that person's family or their friends or their neighbors actually can't even change the programming, which is very, very sinister.
Yeah. And Seth, this was deliberately engineered this way. What you just described is something that afflicts tens of millions of our fellow Americans. And unfortunately, it's happening now all across the world. People need to understand this was deliberately engineered. And you can go back in history and you can trace the process through which we arrived at where we are. Behavioral psychologist Wilhelm Wundt at the University of Leipzig was a major player in first starting this process. Then you go to the Soviet Union. The Soviets were obsessed with this idea of creating the new Soviet man. And so they had psychologists and social scientists working on this problem. People like Lev Vygotsky, who, by the way, inspired what we today call social emotional learning, which is really the bedrock of what's happening in the government schools today, far more so than academics. You have people like Ivan Pavlov, famous for his experiments with the dogs and conditioning them to display a physical response to the bell. They started associating the bell with food, and so they would salivate whether there was food there or not. These were all experiments designed not to condition dogs, but to condition people. And so this has become increasingly sophisticated, increasingly effective. Now it's intersecting with artificial intelligence and with computer programming. B.F. Skinner came up with the Skinner box, and famously was accused of putting his daughter in the Skinner box, where they were using a combination, and whether he did or not is subject for another day. But they were conditioning organisms, and they really regard the human as kind of a slightly more advanced circus animal that can be conditioned, that can be trained using reward, using punishment. They have now advanced to the point where they can do this with computer programming in a very scientific way. They can condition children to have this response that you just described in response to certain triggers, like the word Trump, like the word America, right? And so that's what has happened now. And these young people, they haven't reasoned themselves into this position. And so older people get frustrated. Well, why won't they listen to facts? Why won't they listen to logic? It's because they're not using logic. They're not using reason. They're not even using facts to come to these conclusions. These are emotional responses that have been conditioned into them. And so what we need to find out eventually is a way to bypass this programming. But this was always the goal. If you go back to the people who created the system that we call today the public school system, they always had in mind bringing about a fundamental transformation of society by transforming the individuals. And so I documented that history very extensively in my new book, Indoctrinating Our Children to Death, starting with the first guy to seriously propose that the government ought to be educating children in the first place. His name was Robert Owen, an incredible ideologue. He claimed to be waging war on what he called the great trinity of evil. That was his term to describe this. The great trinity of evil, by the way, was private property, marriage, and family, and of course religion, in particular Christianity. He had a special hatred for Christianity. And just a few months before he died, we got some really interesting transcripts from a conference he convened. It was called the Congress on the Advanced Minds of the World. And he claimed to be communicating with spiritual entities that were talking to him. I know it sounds crazy, through Ouija boards and tapping on the walls and stuff. And he was quite sure that they were dead people that he knew when they were alive. But his mission in life.
Gold has surged 46% in less than a year, doubling the gains of the NASDAQ and the S&P 500. But this isn't just another rally. Global reserves are shifting, exposing cracks in the monetary system. Investors are losing confidence in paper gold and demanding physical metal, creating a massive gap between gold owed and gold available. But this isn't about how institutions broke another system. It's about how you can profit from it. Right now, Noble Gold Investments has a limited supply of investment-grade gold bars and coins available. As banks scramble to fulfill their obligations, pushing gold prices higher, you can profit. Smart investors are already moving into physical gold. Noble Gold Investments makes it easy for you to do the same. And right now, when you make a qualified investment, Noble Gold will add a free 10th ounce gold coin to your order. Don't wait until it's too late. Visit goldwithseth.com or call 626-654-1906 now and turn their panic into your profit. Again, that's goldwithseth.com or 626-654-1906. You'll find that information in the description for the show as well.
Was to transform society. And this is actually the guy who inspired the first ever system of government education, what took root in Prussia. And he actually outlines that process in his autobiography. He talks about a Baron Jacobi who got a hold of his essays on how the government ought to be educating children, took him back to the Prussian dictator. The Prussian dictator said, wow, this is great. Interior Minister, make me such a system here. And it's an incredible story. From there, it got re-imported into the United States by an individual called Horace Mann. And then that's when John Dewey picked it up with big funding from the Rockefeller. John Dewey, of course, was an aficionado of the Soviet Union. He had traveled in the Soviet Union, thought so highly of it that he wrote a bunch of articles and essays in the New Republic about what a great system it was, and decided that education, as he put it, was the mechanism to bring about the transformation of society. And so you had this twin track. One side was dumbing down the population. They've been incredibly effective on this. We have the smoking gun evidence that was their plan from the beginning. And then the other track, which was to fundamentally change people's worldviews. Going back to Robert Owen, he was really upset that people were clinging to these ideas of marriage and family and private property and morality. And his mission in life was to create a communist society. And this was before Karl Marx, by the way. And he believed so fervently in this that he set up a commune in Indiana. It was called New Harmony, where he tried out some of these ideas. Obviously, it failed because communism never works. But he concluded that the reason it didn't work wasn't because communism is stupid, wasn't because human nature requires things like private property and the family. It was because these people had been raised and educated in a thoroughly Christian society that clung to these values. So the solution was then to have the government educate them and teach them a new way of thinking. So that's kind of the history of how we got here in a nutshell. It has obviously gotten more and more effective over the years. But if we don't deal with this, again, it will literally mean the end of our civilization as we have known it.
So I want to take a look at just a few basic figures and have you help us understand them, and then kind of go back into the history, specifically the Rockefellers and their involvement in the American education system. So right now, on average in this nation, when someone graduates from high school, right? When I graduated from high school, I could read, I could write, I went to art school, so I didn't go to some Ivy League, college school, but I feel lucky that I didn't. I went to a school that encouraged creative thinking and problem solving, and especially industrial design was it was like a merger of engineering and creativity, which I really enjoyed. That's how my mind works. But right now, what is the literacy rate of the average high school graduate that comes up through a public school? And what does it mean to say that someone is illiterate? Because, for me, I think of, say Huckleberry Finn, right? Or, the Adventures of Tom Sawyer. I think of the people that they literally couldn't read, like the slaves. A lot of the slaves that you could hand them a book and they had no idea what they're looking at. And that's what I think of as being illiterate. But what is the current literacy rate of high school graduates here in America?
I'm so glad we're talking about this, Seth. We're going to have to open Pandora's box here because it's a very complex subject and there's a lot of misinformation.
Good.
But I want to start by saying I would argue that the majority of the children graduating from high school today are functionally illiterate. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. And again, we have to go back into history a little bit to understand this. There is a way that is used to teach reading today that it's gone under various terms over the decades, over the generations. They've called it the look-say method, the whole word method, the sight word method. So there's lots of different names and marketing slogans associated with this. But let's start back at the beginning. The first people to actually use this method were very well intentioned. It was a Reverend Thomas Golodet. He was running an asylum for what they used to call the deaf and the dumb in Hartford. These were children who couldn't hear, who couldn't speak, and of course we have a phonetic writing system. Right? And this should make sense to people, but there are a lot of people who are like, "What? What does that mean?" So phonetic writing system means that in our system of writing, we have symbols, and those symbols represent sounds. So an A could be a or an eh, or a P will be a P, a B will be a B sound. Now, a deaf child can't hear that, right? So that's meaningless to him to try to say that this symbol represents a P sound. Well, what does a P sound mean? I don't know what that means. So this Reverend Thomas Gallaudet said, well, hey, maybe we could teach them to memorize whole words as if the words themselves were symbols, kind of like in Chinese or some of the old ideographic writing systems, where rather than a phonetic writing system, you had a symbol that represented a word or an idea or something along those lines. So this reverend started teaching these deaf children to memorize words. Really, really smart kids could memorize hundreds, sometimes thousands of words. And so compared to not being able to access anything on a page, that was a huge development. It was a really positive thing for deaf children because it allowed them to access at least some of our written language. Now, I mentioned earlier Horace Mann. He's the guy who imported the Prussian education system into Massachusetts. He got himself selected as the first ever Secretary of Education for any one of our states. And, whether his motives were well intended or not, I can't say. I suspect they were nefarious, but for Horace Mann, we'll just leave that an open question right now. He said, well, hey, if it works so good on deaf children, let's try it on non-deaf children. So he was busy building a government school system in Massachusetts, and he introduced this method of teaching reading into the public schools in Boston. Now, it didn't even take a couple of years for all of the schoolmasters in Boston to write a letter, and I actually have a copy of the letter. It was published as an appendix in a book called The New Illiterates in 1973 by my friend, mentor, and colleague Samuel Blumenfeld, Dr. Samuel Blumenfeld. And in this very diplomatic letter, they critique Mr. Mann's new method of teaching reading. And they're very kind back then. They say, sorry, Mr. Mann, but we're not going to be using this. Science and experience show that this isn't an effective way of teaching reading, so we're not going to do it, basically. The modern equivalent of, you moron, this doesn't work. We're not going to be doing this. They were very polite back then. But they totally debunked this, and we didn't hear about it again, essentially for 50 years. Now, enter onto the stage John Dewey, who we mentioned earlier, the guy who loved the Soviet model, the guy who wanted socialism in America. Now, he differed with the revolutionary socialists in that he believed a gradual process of indoctrinating the population would be more effective than a violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie. But he wrote an essay all the way back in 1898. It was called The Primary Education Fetish. And this is such an important essay that Dr. Blumenfeld and I actually republished it as an appendix in a book that we did back in 2014 called Crimes of the Educators. What he outlines in there is a plan to dumb down the American population using the public school system. Now, he doesn't exactly put it in those terms, but he says, what do we need to teach all these little kids how to read and write and do math for? What they really need is to learn how to be part of the collective, learn how to think of themselves as part of the group and subordinate their interests to the greater whole of society. They can worry about reading and all that kind of stuff later. So John Dewey, and I mentioned Rockefeller. Rockefeller comes alongside of him, gives him $3.1 million to try out this kookiness in an experimental school he
what
sets
year
up at
was
the
that?
University of Chicago. Well, the essay that I mentioned was 1898.
And when did that money
John
come
Dewey
to him?
that was in the early 1900s. So the Rockefeller Foundation was set up in the first few years. It was called the General Education Board. And so Dewey was probably the primary figure in education in America for a period of at least several decades, starting in the early 1900s, going all the way through to when he was named honorary life president of the National Education Association, now the biggest union in the country. So this was a multi-decade period. But one of his early projects in the early 1900s was this experimental school at the University of Chicago, where they were trying out these methods, including, by the way, the whole word method of teaching reading. And
actually,
they graduated.
Alex, can I jump in really quickly? I just want to show you this. $3.1 million in, let's just say hypothetically 1905 is $112 million today.
This is an unfathomable amount of money. And in fact, Rockefeller put in the biggest philanthropic, if you want to call it that, donation in the history of America into this general education board in the early 1900s. He put a guy in charge of it called Frederick Gates. We've got a lot of his writings where he fantasizes about molding the population. And we don't need statesmen and scientists and philosophers. We need workers, right? So it's almost like a bad joke, Seth. A communist and a super capitalist walk into a bar and they decide to dumb down everybody's kids so that they'll be obedient little subservient worker drones. Except it's not a joke. It's a true story. So Dewey resurrects this system of whole word method. And after he's done in Chicago, after he proves that this cranks out a bunch of little illiterates who can't read, and I should clarify here again to go back to your original question, Seth, people who are exposed to this whole word method will be able to read some things, right? If they're really smart, maybe they'll have memorized hundreds, maybe even thousands of words. And so they'll look at a page and they'll understand some of the words on there. And then they'll be able, using context clues, if there's pictures, they'll be able to decipher some of what's on there. But they're not reading in the traditional sense that you and I understand, in the sense that you and I read, where we sound out the letter and understand what is meant to be conveyed by each
that's
of those
phonics,
symbols.
right? Like that. I'm reading Hooked on Phonics, and you say, it reminds me of Chris Farley in Almost Heroes. I'm not sure if you've seen that movie. He was learning how to read, and he's looking at the sign over the town, and he's slowly sounding out. Say it's Theodore. It's a or Theodore, right? Like that's how I was taught to read. So you give me, they give me a pretty complicated word, and I can most accurately sound it out pretty well, right? But so the kids aren't being taught that now, right? They're being taught the English language the same way you'd be taught Chinese, where you're just memorizing characters and tones, basically.
Exactly right, Seth. That's exactly right. And so John Dewey, after he was done at the University of Chicago, he goes and sets up shop at Teachers College at Columbia University, the most important college of education in the world, without even a close second. Starts cranking out a bunch of materials. And by the time World War II came around, this became, all these school districts had all this money, et cetera. They started buying all these programs, and then it became ubiquitous. That's when, right after World War II, is when this really became the dominant way of teaching reading. Now, there were plenty of teachers at that time who said, wait, this is crazy. We're not going to do this. We're going to teach kids phonics. So thankfully, a lot of Americans can still read. But this continued. And there have been multiple exposés of this, right? In 1955, Rudolph Flesch wrote an incredible book, Why Johnny Can't Read. And what he said, and I'm almost quoting verbatim, I don't have the quote in front of me, but he said, the reason Johnny can't read is that the teaching of reading in all the schools, in all the textbooks, is totally wrong and flies in the face of all common sense. So that's what has happened here. Now, if you go all the way, fast forward to Common Core, which is now the national system of standards that exists across the United States, regardless of what your politician might tell you. They actually start the kids off with memorizing sight words. So you can walk into first grade classrooms, kindergarten classrooms, anywhere in America, and you'll find a list of sight words that the kids are supposed to memorize. They'll send the kids home with flashcards that the parents are supposed to be complicit in this. And what happens is, the Common Core people say, oh, we have phonics in there. Yeah, they sprinkle in a little bit of phonics after they've introduced this reflex where you approach a word as if it were a symbol. And so, can you salvage some of that? Sometimes. But what happens is this reflex gets built into the children. And so that's a long way of answering your question, Seth. But the federal government did a literacy survey back in 1992. It was the most comprehensive literacy survey to date in America, other than some that happened early in our history. And I'll get to those in a moment. They categorized Americans into 5 different categories, 1 through 5. Now, the bottom 2 categories are essentially functionally illiterate, right? They may have memorized some words. They see a red sign that's an octagon, and they say, ooh, a stop sign, right? They may be able to make out the Campbell Soup logo. But if you put a Bible in front of them, you put the Constitution in front of them, they'll be able to pick out a word here or there that they remember from, Dr. Seuss, but they're not going to be able to grasp what is being said here. And so the Federal Literacy Survey found that 50% of Americans were in the bottom 2 categories. Okay, that's how bad this was. This was in the 90s.
92,
now,
right?
Yes, 1992, exactly. And they have not done subsequent studies that were as comprehensive. But I think that's probably a very accurate marker. These were adults, by the way. It's probably a very accurate marker of where we were at. About half of Americans can read, about half of Americans have been handicapped through this process. And now this debate is coming back. Now they're talking about this in state capitals around the country. But I would argue that the majority of our young people cannot read properly, and that is absolutely by design.
It's incredible. It makes me, even though I went to public school, it makes me thankful that I was taught phonics and the education I was given. So tying back into Rockefeller, so you have Dewey. Now, am I correct in remembering that Dewey was a communist? Like that's pretty common
Yes.
knowledge, right?
He wouldn't have called himself that, but if you read his writings, it's very clear. He actually pointed to a novel published in 1888 by a guy called Edward Bellamy as his desired model for the United States of America. The book was called Looking Backward, and it was a fiction novel about a communist America in the year 2000, where we would have moved beyond private property, beyond outdated family structures. So yes, he was a communist in the truest sense of the term. However, he disagreed with the Marxists in that he didn't believe violent revolution was the best approach. He believed that a gradual process of educating people to bring about this transformation was going to be the most viable, the most successful way of bringing about this new order without private property, without family, etc.
So basically, the Rockefellers, it was John D. Rockefeller at that time, right? At that
John D. Rockefeller Sr.,
right?
that's right. Yep.
So at that time, John D. Rockefeller gave, the equivalent of over $100 million to, in essence, to a communist to, in essence, overthrow the American education system, right? To systematically dumb down right? Not just the children, because the children become the leaders. They become the future presidents, the future CEOs, the future parents. And I know that this may be a little bit kind of opening up in our Pandora's box, but why? And I've covered Rockefeller's involvement with the medical system like very, very heavily, and what happened when he kind of got involved in really overhauling the entire medical system, which really brought us our modern medical system today, where a lot of the real cures have been demonized as quackery and all this kind of like old stuff. It's like, we have modern pharmaceuticals that can treat your symptoms when the old things can cure the actual issue itself. But what do you think, if you could kind of speculate as to his intentions of that, and what does the end goal look like if Rockefeller had his way with the American public?
It's a very interesting question, Seth. And as you know, it's always hard to understand somebody's motives. Rarely will people be fully transparent about their motives if they have evil intentions. And I do believe with every fiber of my being that the Rockefeller dynasty has had evil intentions. It may be as simple as just the love of money, right? These guys really loved money. They didn't want competition. They had very successful business enterprises. They were some of the wealthiest people to have ever existed in human history.
They want workers, not competitors.
Right, exactly. Right. They want people working for them, not competing against them in the various industries that they were in. But the Congress actually took an interest in this. This was back in the late 1940s, bleeding into the early 1950s. And Congress put together what they called the Select Committee to Investigate Tax-Exempt Foundations and Comparable Organizations. There was the Reese Committee and the Cox Committee. And I would encourage people who are interested in this question to go look at these reports. Now, this was a few decades after a lot of this, but what the investigators for Congress found was truly incredible. First of all, they found, and again, late 1940s, early 1950s, they found that there had been a revolution in the United States. And I'm actually going to quote from the report here. They said, "This could not have occurred peacefully or with the consent of the majority unless education in the United States had been prepared in advance to endorse it." This is an official congressional report by the Select Committee to Investigate Tax-Exempt Foundations and Comparable Organizations. One of the main foundations they were looking at was the Rockefeller Foundations. And as you read this report, what you'll find is these foundations were working to hijack education in America to enable what this report described as oligarchical collectivism, right? Collectivism ruled by an oligarchy, ruled by people like the Rockefellers. They said this was done by promoting internationalism, which today we call globalism. It was done by promoting moral relativism. And I mean, this is really an incredible report. They show that these foundations, and it wasn't just Rockefeller, by the way. It was Ford, it was Carnegie. There were several others that were in this mix, and they were pouring money into Columbia. They were pouring money into Harvard, the University of Chicago. They say some of these larger foundations have directly supported subversion in the true meaning of that term, namely the process of undermining some of our vitally protective concepts and principles. It says these foundations actively supported attacks upon our social and governmental system and financed the promotion of socialism and collectivist ideas. Again, this is all in the official report. It says these foundations supported a conscious distortion of history. They propagandized blindly for the United Nations as the hope of the world. One of their investigators, Aaron Sargent, testified in a congressional hearing that this was a violation of federal law. They said, in approaching this problem of foundation influence, the subversive teaching problem is a foundation problem. He says this movement is closely related to Fabian socialism. And the chief investigator for this, his name was Norman Dodd. He's been gone for some years now, but he did an interview before he died with a man called G. Edward Griffin. People might know him from the interview with Yuri Bezmenov. And what he said was truly astounding. He said the head of the Ford Foundation, when this committee was formed, invited him to come to his office in New York and said, look, you don't even need to investigate us. I'll tell you what we're doing. We're working with the White House, and we are, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it's almost word for word. He said, we are working to so alter life in the United States that it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. And right away that butts
Wait, so
up
that was the
against people.
Ford Foundation?
That was the head of the Ford Foundation, Alan Geither, as documented by the chief investigator in this investigation. And people have trouble processing that because we've always been taught that communists want to eat the capitalists. You know, it doesn't make sense to people. It doesn't compute that the capitalists would actually have been funding the communists and the revolutionaries. But if you go back even to the Bolshevik Revolution, Anthony Sutton, the great historian from Stanford, documented that Bolshevik Revolution was financed by the mega banks on Wall Street. So we've had this problem all along. It's just that people haven't been taught about it in school. People haven't been hearing about it in the media, which is owned in many cases by these same evildoers. And that, I think, is critical to understanding how we got here. It was a coalition of super capitalists, oligarchical collectivists who wanted to rule over us, and communists who I think in some respects really were useful idiots. They believed, oh, we're going to have equality and utopia and life's going to be so great. Oftentimes they're the ones who are lined up against the wall and shot once the revolution succeeds. But Trotsky comes to mind with the ice pick in his head. But I think all of this is critical to understanding how we ended up in this mess. Even though it seems like ancient history, you can't understand what's happening in the school today without knowing where all this came from.
And gosh, incredible. And so looking to where things are at today, you can see that this was a long-term plan. This wasn't something that was, say John D. Rockefeller coming out and saying, okay, hey, in the next 10 years, I want this huge transformation. The one thing that I've learned in studying these families, right, these kind of elite bloodlines, what might you call it, is that their perspective is multi-generational. They don't look at things the way that we do, which is also why, as much as they've destroyed the concept of family and these familial bonds with the commoners, right? Obviously, they've been attacking these things. It's the opposite for them. They are protecting their kin. They're protecting their bloodlines in such intense ways. So what makes me kind of look at this whole situation and think is that this is something that John D. Rockefeller was setting up for his kin and his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren. He was creating a society here in America that his family would be able to rule as an oligarch. Now, obviously, the Rockefellers were, they were funded by other people. They had ties into the Rothschilds, so it wasn't like that they were just independently the kings of America. There were other very important and very wealthy families, a lot of the European families, a lot of the banking families that were coordinating with them, right? Then you tie in these families and you get into the, talk about G. Edward Griffin, who I've had the pleasure of interviewing a couple of times. Brilliant man. It's amazing. I'm so glad he's still alive. And he's just going strong still at, approaching, close to 90 years old, I think. He's getting up there, but he's such an important voice because then you tie that all into the Federal Reserve System and, again, modern medical system. And what you can see is if you start to take a step back and you're painting the whole picture of this, what you can see is these elite bloodline families engineering a society in America that would lead to our own downfall and would allow them to rule us. And you made an example earlier. You said you're mentioning how, well, communism, but capitalism. Why is it that the rich capitalists want communism? It's like, well, once you're at that place where you are, not just the 1%, but the 0.0001%, it's in your interest, if you are power hungry and you want all the money, all the resources for yourself, it's in your best interest to actually have that idea that, okay, well, the commoners, we're going to give them communism to keep them in line. But of course, it's not going to apply to them.
That's right. And that's what we see in communist societies too, right? There's no equality. The overlords live like emperor god kings, and the peasants starve and wait in bread lines to get some food, right? So the guy that Rockefeller put in charge of his foundation, his name was Frederick Gates. And there's a very famous quote by him that has been verified where he kind of outlines the idea. And he says in very clear terminology, that I can even quote it. I've got it here. It says, in our dream, we have limitless resources. The people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present educational conventions fade from our mind, like when we used to teach kids to read so they could access the accumulated wisdom of mankind. He says, we unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive rural folk. He says, we shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of science or learning. We're not to raise up from among them authors and orators and poets or men of letters. We shall not search for the embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor will we cherish even the humbler ambition to raise up from among them lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we now have ample supply. So you've got obviously the financial motive here. They want good workers, and I think it's important also to mention that there was a religious motivation here as well. And this sometimes conflicts again with people's preconceived notions. They think communism enemy of religion. Well, John Dewey was actually a very religious man. He got together with a few dozen of his buddies, and they set up what they thought was a new religion. They called it humanism, and they came together. They wrote what they called the Humanist Manifesto. Today it's known as Humanist Manifesto 1. And people can read this. It's basically communism dressed up in religious garb, but it starts with the first and fundamental presupposition that really is the bedrock of this religion. And I'll quote from it. It says, religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created.
Wow.
And then, of course, they talk about we got to get rid of the profit motive. We've got to reorganize the economic means of production. But this is a really important thing for people to understand, Seth. Even if you're not a Christian, I mean, obviously that's a direct contradiction to what the Bible teaches. In the beginning, God created. And
look at their logo.
Probably,
good
yes.
Without a God. Like they're not even hiding it. Good
That's
without
right.
a God.
Yep. And
Gosh,
so very, very.
It looks like even their logo. It looks like Sauron, like the Eye of Sauron or something. There's something very evil about that. Anyway, sorry to interrupt you.
No, you're good. And I'm glad you brought this up. They've since come out with new and improved versions of this. They've got the Humanist Manifesto 2 that goes all in for globalism. But they understood that education was the means for propagating this religion. And I just want to pause here for a moment for people to consider the implications, because I know some of your audience out there saying, well, I'm not Christian. I don't care if John Dewey had a goofy false religion. Our country is based on what our founding fathers described as a self-evident truth. And of course, I got these ideas from the Bible, but it is, in a very real sense, I think, a self-evident truth. And that self-evident truth that they staked their lives on was the fact that we are created equal, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness. In other words, if you believe John Dewey's religion, there is no God, there cannot possibly be any such thing as a God-given right, because there's no God to give you rights. In other words, you have no rights. You have whatever freedoms and privileges we, the collective, determine are appropriate and are in the best interest of society, and nothing more. So this is a revolutionary religious movement. And this is going to sound crazy to people, but I encourage you to go read the Supreme Court decisions. 1962 and 1963, the Supreme Court of the United States banned prayer. They banned Bible in the government schools. And according to the dissenting justice who wrote the dissent in this case, Justice Potter Stewart, he said, what they've done here is not establish neutrality with respect to religion. What my colleagues on this court have done, they have established the religion of secularism, or as John Dewey would have known, the religion of humanism. And so, under the guise of enforcing the First Amendment, which says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, the Supreme Court established a false religion that is entirely incompatible both with the Bible and with the founding documents of this country. And then we wonder why our society is falling apart. Well, we're now 4 generations into indoctrination in this dangerous false religion.
I'm curious, and you probably would know this, but of the, again, going back to the kids coming out of school right now, do you know what percentage of them are atheist or agnostic or whatever kind of blend of belief system versus say 50 years ago or 80 years ago? Because I suspect that that's you mentioned before the two elements of really dumbing people down, but also then indoctrinating them with a certain worldview and a belief system, really a program that keeps them subservient, not questioning the authority, et cetera. But I think that also part of that then is the destruction of faith, right? Obviously, removing God from the school, the separation of church and state. Oh, what a brilliant idea! Separate church and state. So, okay, so you can see how they've used that, right? They hide behind these good ideals. But what are the statistics on belief and faith in the youth these days? America is under siege. You've seen the headlines. Terror attacks, chaos, and whispers of coordinated threats. Intelligence insiders and whistleblowers are sounding the alarm. For years, the border has been wide open, allowing dangerous groups of terrorists, cartels, even foreign soldiers to infiltrate our nation. The deep state doesn't want you prepared. And even with Trump coming back in charge, smooth sailing certainly is not guaranteed. Experts are warning us disruptions are coming. Chaos is just around the corner. Think about it. What would you do if another pandemic hits? Or if our grid goes dark? Or if coordinated attacks erupt across our country overnight? Right now is the time to act while you still can. Your family's survival depends on having a secure food supply. That is why Heaven's Harvest exists. Heaven's Harvest offers the highest quality, long-term, storable food, delicious, nutritious, and designed to last up to 25 years. Imagine the peace of mind knowing that you have 3, 6, or even 12 months of food ready for any emergency. Don't wait for the shelves to go empty or for the next attack to catch you off guard. Take control now. Go to heavensharvest.com and secure your supply. Use promo code SETH, that's SETH, for an exclusive 15% discount on your entire order. Picture this: your family is safe, secure, and well-fed while chaos unfolds outside. That security starts today. Heaven's Harvest, because tomorrow isn't promised. Protect your family by preparing today. Visit heavensharvest.com right now and use promo code SETH to save 15% off. Don't wait until it's too late. Your family is depending on you.
Yeah, and by nature, these are very difficult things to track, Seth, but I have done my best to do that. We do have a lot of polling data that, whether it's exactly accurate or not, I think is less important than the general trends that they highlight. And I'll give you a few quick examples. I'm a millennial, which obviously is always terribly embarrassing to admit.
What
everybody assumes you're an
born?
idiot, right? I was 85.
I said I'm 86. So
Okay, so very close. Yeah, and you always hesitate to admit that you're a millennial.
Oh, I know. I'm embarrassed by it.
No kidding, right? But so there's been some really interesting polling done on this. The Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation commissioned a scientific poll back in 2017, and they found that 70% of millennial Americans were identifying as socialists and said they were going to vote for socialists in the future. 36% had a positive view of communism, to show you how bad it had gotten. Now, there are other surveys that have come out. Surveys that show for the first time in all of American history, only a minority of millennials of this particular generation identify as Christian. And then you dig into that deeper, right? Because a lot of people still identify as Christian, but they don't quite know what that means. There's a guy called George Barna, who I've had the pleasure of speaking with and interviewing before. Very good researcher. He's probably the preeminent expert on this, although Dan Smithwick at the Nehemiah Institute does good work here too. They're trying to track the actual worldview of these people who identify as Christians. And what he is finding is a dramatic plunge in the number of people who have a biblical worldview, to the point now where the younger folks have maybe 2% of the people have a biblical worldview. This is happening very quickly. You see the dramatic decline of Christianity, the dramatic rise of atheism and other isms, pantheism, things like
Satanism.
Absolutely. I mean, we have after-school Satan clubs at public schools across the country now. So this stuff is now really accelerating, and it's going to get a whole lot worse unless somebody hits the brakes here.
And so that takes me to where my questioning goes now, because I've studied a lot of different philosophies and religions, and I was, very, especially my college years, I was very fascinated and looked into a lot of Eastern belief systems, and really kind of it really helped me kind of shape my worldview, and it really helped me to strengthen my faith, in fundamentally, which is, I think, very positive. But one thing that I like in terms of the kind of Eastern perspective is the concept of the yin yang, which to me is also, it's really rooted in something very similar to what a lot of the traditional scientists, right? Every force has an equal and opposite, reaction, right? Every action has equal and opposite reaction. And so I really think that there is a pendulum that happens, right? So with the yin yang, it's kind of like this constant balance of the plus and the negative, right? The good and the bad. They're constantly cycling, right? It's spinning, and there's constantly, you hit these extremes, and once you hit that extreme, it pulls back, right? You can't go for the extreme forever because you end up with complete destruction. There has to be some sort of balance, which I really believe is God's design. And so looking at this, do you think that we've hit that extreme in this agenda, and this satanic and atheist agenda, whereas now it's starting to pull back, right? Do you think that's starting to happen now, are there any movements or trends in the youth that show that they're actually becoming more religious and more, kind of more Christians coming up from the very young ages, which would kind of go against what you would think Rockefeller's goals would be, where maybe he saw it as a very linear downward thing, where it's a downward spiral until the entire nation is communist and atheist. Are those trends shifting?
There are some encouraging signs, Seth, and we don't know yet whether they're going to materialize into full-blown trends, but and this is not isolated to the United States. We're seeing similar things in Western Europe, where they're actually a little bit ahead of us on some of this secularization and some of this embrace of atheism, communism, materialism. But we're seeing among young men in particular, I mean, young guys, 17, 18, 19, 20, we're seeing a surge in this demographic going to the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, and not so much evangelicalism, which is interesting. It seems to be more toward traditions and structure and hierarchy and things like that. I was in Sweden over the Christmas break. I spent many years living there, and we went to church. It was a Baptist church, and I was astounded. It had more than doubled in size from the last time I had been there, probably a year and a third before. And the pastor said something really interesting that stuck with me, and I started looking into this, and the same thing is happening in other countries. He said the statistics agency, whatever, had done a survey in Sweden among young people and asked them, what do you think is going to be trending in 2025? What's going to be the hottest topic of discussion? And the answer, which I thought was fascinating, because Sweden is probably the most secularized of all of the countries, the answer was Jesus. And I don't know what to do with that yet. We'll see what comes out of it. But I think, to your point, we really have gone way over the edge. It wouldn't surprise me to see something of a pendulum swing going back in the other direction. But if that is going to happen, I think we may be in the beginning phases of it. And I think as people see the bankruptcy, as people see the fruit of this diabolical worldview that's being taught now in the public schools, not just in the United States, but around the world, there will have to be a reckoning. People will say, okay, well, we've done this for a while now. What has happened? Our families collapsed. Everybody's addicted to drugs. Suicide is through the roof at never before seen levels. We can't even sustain the institutions that make life possible anymore. We're going to have to go back and see what used to work. So I'm hopeful that we'll eventually see something like that. We may be seeing the beginnings of it now, but I think it's something that's going to actually require conscious, dedicated effort by people who want to try to salvage what's left of civilization before we go over the cliff. So,
and that leads me to the last topic I want to hit before we close out here is, what can we do, right? So I'll say, I think you probably homeschool your kids, I'd imagine, just kind of knowing more about your lifestyle. I've got a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old. Obviously, we're not doing intensive homeschooling at this point, but that's our goal, right? Is we're going to be homeschooling, and a lot of our schooling is going to be tending to the goats and chickens and counting the chicken eggs, and how to climb, climbing a tree and falling off and bruising your elbow and learning that lesson. Really learning through play and a lot of those things. And obviously, it will introduce structure as they get a little bit older. But for the people that are watching this, and whether it's a grandparent has grandchildren or a father or a mother, what can we do to reverse this, or how can we change this?
Well, thank you, Seth. And I think that's the $50 trillion question that we must get to, because if we don't reverse this, I mean, literally hell awaits us. So we've got to be really, really serious about finding solutions to this. I would argue, first of all, you already are homeschooling, Seth. I think a lot of parents don't realize they're homeschooling, but they're teaching their children to talk and to walk and to think and to reason and to have good values. And all this happens naturally, right? That's the great thing about homeschooling. It doesn't have to be following a curriculum and a structure. You're always educating your kids, no matter what you're doing with them. And that's what I try to tell parents who think it's going to be this really huge, dangerous leap into home. Like, you've been homeschooling since the child was born. You got it under control. So my wife and I, we homeschool our 6 children. I wouldn't trade it for the world. We were involved in classical conversations. You actually had my friend Robert Borton's on from CC. It's a wonderful program. I'm actually a fellow there. I can't say enough good things about it. I've had my kids enrolled there almost since they were old enough to do formal homeschooling. We're also involved in another co-op, but there are tons of options out there. And I think this is the most micro level, right? As parents, as grandparents, as aunts and uncles, we've got to take responsibility for the children in our immediate vicinity, right? The children in your home, the children on your block, the children in your community, the children in your church, whatever. That's a really good starting point. Make sure your own children are getting a good education. They're learning how to read properly. They're learning how to think. They're learning how to reason. They're learning logic, they're learning grammar, they're learning math, how the world works. These are all really, really important things. And that's just step one, right? But that's something that everybody can do right now. We don't need to pass any new laws or win any elections. You could pull your children out of the system this moment. Check the laws in your state. I serve as the volunteer executive director for Public School Exit. We've got a lot of information there for people who want to make this decision, publicschoolexit.com. But that's the first step. Make the right choice with your own children, the children in your own life. And then we've got to get to the hard work of letting our fellow Americans know. I often compare the situation that we're in to it like a burning building, right? And your children are trapped inside, and you smell the burning flesh. You hear the screams of these kids, and you say, no, I don't hear anything. Yet you hear it, and you smell it. Run into that building and get them out, right? That's step one. Don't bother with petitions or lobbying your legislators after you've got your own children out. And any parent would risk their own life for their own children, so don't worry about a little financial sacrifice. After you get them out, there's still other kids in there. Now what, right? We would be terrible human beings if we said, just let them roast. We've got to deal with that. So I would recommend starting with our own education. We need to understand how we got into this mess. What did education look like before? There was a study in 1812 by DuPont de Nemours that found that not more than 4 in 1,000 young Americans could not write and read legibly, even neatly. So we have gone so far down. What did we used to do that worked so well? There's a lot of resources for that. I've published a lot on my website, libertysentinel.org. I've published a lot in the New American. In fact, I did a series for the Epic Times, a 22-part series that's got a lot of that in there. I would encourage people to check that out. I've done 2 books on this, including my latest one, Indoctrinating Our Children to Death, Government Schools War on Faith, Family, and Freedom, and How to Stop It. And it's been endorsed by some really great Americans, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, Josh Phillip of the Epic Times, General Michael Flynn, a lot of great Americans. And that's got a lot of the information that you will need, not just to understand how we got here, but also to understand how we get back. And then at that point, I would recommend getting involved in something, right? Maybe run for your state legislature, maybe run for Congress, right? There's a lot of different ways we can get involved. And if you don't want to run, maybe support somebody who's running. But whatever you do, protect your kids, educate the people around you, and let's try to stop this before it's too late.
And one thing I'd also say as a father is speaking to grandparents. I know a lot of the audience here, I've interacted with them, I met them at different events, and they're grandparents. They have grandchildren. Is if my mom, hypothetically, if she said, now she lives a couple states away, so it's not as easy, but hypothetically, if one of my parents came to me and said, hey, you know what, Seth, I'm going to retire now, and I want to retire so that I can just focus on helping you homeschool. Now, I'm lucky that my wife and I, we both live at home. I work from home. So it's really easy to work this into our schedule, and we have a lot of flexibility with that. But I know there's a lot of parents that they have to work, they're both working a job, right? Mama and dad are working a job, and the only option is to send them away. So I'd say for grandparents, if they can step in and say, look, I'm going to help with this. I'm going to take a cut on my own lifestyle, whatever it takes, but I'm going to come in and I'm going to help raise this next generation. I can tell you that most people I know would be so thrilled if their parents came in and did that. I know there's certain issues, and you've got the kind of the wife and the mother-in-law might not get along, or things that happen like that in family dynamics. But anything that grandparents can do to step in for their grandchildren is huge. And that's one thing I would just say, like as a father, that like I would love to see more of the kind of the boomer generation stepping in, saying, "Hey, how can I help relieve your burden of trying to manage, covering, living in today's world where the dollar is going to crap and inflation's soaring and everything's really expensive and people are working 2-3 jobs." That's one thing I would say.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Seth. And grandparents can make all the difference in the world. If the mom and dad are feeling overwhelmed, maybe grandma and grandpa coming in 1 day a week, 2 days a week, maybe helping a little bit with the private school tuition, that can make the difference between having the child trapped in the burning building and getting the child out. So there's a lot of different ways to do this, and I would encourage grandparents very strongly to try to play a positive role here. You can make all the difference in the lives of your grandchildren, and it might just be a little bit of help that you need to offer, and it'll be a blessing to you, and it'll be a blessing to your children, and it'll be a blessing to your grandchildren, all the way on down the line. So folks, there are very few things more important than this particular issue. So I thank you for allowing me to talk about it, Seth, and I do hope people will spend some time thinking about this very carefully.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And I thank you for doing what you're doing. I thank you for obviously, so I'll pull up your website here, Liberty Sentinel. I'll put all these links in the show description. You've also got your book. Now, here's a great thing to do, actually. If you're a parent or a grandparent, buy the book, read the book, pass it on to your kids, learn. Even this interview, share this interview with people, because I think it's really important to understand the history. And this is why I like going into, well, how did we get here? Like, what role did the Rockefellers play 100 years ago? It's not just about digging into some kind of conspiratorial, the Rothschilds and Rockefellers. No, it's understanding, how did we get to where we are right now? Like, what forces kind of put us in the direction that we are right here? And then figuring out how we can change the trajectory for the future, which is really important. So, Alex, thank you for giving us your time today. Thank you for doing what you're doing and really committing your life to not only doing what you're doing professionally, but to also raising a new generation of the Alex 2.0s that, I'm sure that your children will be out there with their own podcasts, writing their own books, doing everything that they're going to be doing to help change and shape society. So thank you for doing that. And thank you for being here with us.
It's a great honor. Thank you very much for having me, Seth, and keep up the good work.
Thank you. Do you keep hearing more cases of your friends and family getting a life-threatening diagnosis of cancer? Or perhaps it's even happened to you? Well, the unfortunate reality is that turbo cancer is now a worldwide epidemic. But the question we should all be asking is, what can I do about it? Well, the good news is that there are therapies that are working and proven in thousands of clinical studies. So one study on PubMed found that breast cancer's growth rate dropped by 40% in only 24 hours after using red light therapy. Another study on prostate cancer found that 49% of the over 400 male participants went into remission with just one red light therapy session. A lymphoma cancer pilot study showed that 3 out of 3 of the patients became cancer-free. It sounds unbelievable, but it's true. And you can discover all this information and more in a special training program from investigative medical journalist Jonathan Otto, who will show you how you can use red light, including the specific wavelengths as proven by studies, for all different types of cancer, as well as tinnitus, weight loss, wrinkles, acne, dementia, cognitive function, depression, anxiety, long COVID, jab injuries, stem cell regeneration, lower back pain, sciatica, the whole array of autoimmune diseases, including thyroid disease, arthritis, lupus, and gut disorders, and so much more. In fact, you can get your own in-home red light therapy device risk-free, as you're completely covered by a 60-day money-back guarantee and a 3-year warranty. On top of that, we've got financing options so you can get it now and pay later. And the best thing, folks, is that this technology has become amazingly affordable. It's way less than you'd expect, with the smaller units costing only a couple $100. So just go to myredlight.com to make sure you don't miss out this free special training program and claim the extremely limited time bonus gifts and discounts, which include an additional 10% off with the coupon code SETH. Again, go to myredlight.com to get access to the free training. And if you make a purchase, make sure you use a promo code SETH, that's SETH, to get an additional 10% off the already heavily discounted red light therapy products.